Hi, everyone. Just to let you know, we'll be starting in just a few moments. Hi, everyone. We'll start in about 3 minutes. Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome, and thank you for joining us. We have a wonderful speaker and a very important and enlightening topic for our webinar today. So we'll get started in just a minute after I go over just a couple of logistical items. There is a slide presentation. Everyone should be able to see the welcome slide of the deck that's now on the screen, on your screen. And if not, please use the URL for this Zoom webinar that's posted on UCNet under the news menu or via the link on the main page of UCNet. We are recording this webinar, so all lines have been muted. And we do want to hear from you, so please use the Zoom chat feature to submit your questions. The chat icon will appear if you hover your mouse along either the bottom or the top of your screen. You'll have a Zoom sort of toolbar. The toolbar will appear, and you'll see the word chat with a little cartoon bubble. And if you click on that, the chat dialog box will open, and you can type your question in the field and then hit enter to send it. And Dr. Cheney will field questions as they are posted in the chat, and then, of course, again, at the end of the presentation. By the end of this week, we'll have a complete recording of this webinar, both audio and visual, and it'll be available on the Stigma-Free UC page on UCNet. So you can just simply go to UCNet and search using the keyword stigma, and it will take you right to the page with the link. In addition, on that page, you'll see the links for previous webinars that we've conducted. Okay, we've got our webinar house now in order, so I'd like to explain a little bit about how today's session fits into the bigger picture. So this webinar was created in partnership with Dr. Cheney and the Stigma-Free UC initiative, which is part of the System-Wide Wellbeing. And System-Wide Wellbeing sponsors and promotes events and programs and resources that impact and improve UC employees' emotional, financial, physical, and nutritional well-being. And in support of UC employees' emotional well-being, the Stigma-Free UC initiative was developed to foster open, positive discussions about mental health, because the first step in reducing and eliminating prejudice regarding mind disorders is to talk about them and to promote awareness around this multifaceted topic. So to that end, the Stigma-Free UC is a one-year awareness project which promotes monthly programming and is focused on the elimination of mental illness discrimination through educational webinars, discussions, videos, and more. Because every human being lies somewhere on the mental illness continuum, the overarching goal is to increase our collective compassion by sharing the vast knowledge of UC experts like Dr. Cheney, who will help us learn about the spectrum of mind disorders and how to avoid ostracizing individuals who live with them. The polarizing concept of the other crazy person no longer exists. The continuum of mental health and illness encompasses all of us. And statistics show that those who learn about mind disorders show more compassion towards those with a disorder. Therefore, throughout our 2018 programs, we'll continue to emphasize that mind disorders are simply part of the human condition. So let me do a brief introduction of Dr. Cheney. She is a medical anthropologist whose work places the voice of the community at the center of scientific inquiry. Her research addresses health disparities in underserved populations, including ethnic and racial minorities, immigrants, veterans, and students, and is currently leading a photo voice project in which students with substance use histories articulate their recovery experiences and their support needs through photography. So I'm now pleased to present Dr. Ann Cheney.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mara, for the wonderful introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and put up my first slide. As Mara said, my name is Ann Cheney. I am an anthropologist, a medical anthropologist particularly, and I am currently leading a study that's called the Photo Voice Project that is around students' experiences of recovery here at UC Riverside, but in particular, what their experiences are like and what kinds of things they need to support their recovery. And while I'll be talking a bit about that, really my presentation today is broad in the sense of thinking about addiction, drug addiction, substance use, and also thinking specifically about how that applies to concepts of being a student, and particularly a student in recovery. The title of the presentation is The Neglected Addict, and this is a term that essentially I was able to developed from my working with students, and they use this term to talk about how others may perceive them. So this is something that we'll talk a bit more today, this idea of the neglected addict. So the title of the presentation, The Neglected Addict, Understanding Stigma, Students in Recovery. And again, at any point, if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and send me a message via the chat. So what is stigma? Last month, Professor Bruce Link, who's here at UC Riverside, he gave a presentation about stigma. So he and others have been instrumental in really defining and characterizing what stigma means. So building from what he presented last month, if you think about stigma, Link and Fellin, they define stigma such that includes a label and a stereotype. Labels link individuals to undesirable characteristics that form the stereotype. So let's think we have a label, we have an undesirable characteristic, and then a stereotype. I'm just going to check this. Okay. So if you think about individuals who may use substance use, we could think about an addict, for instance, as a label. An addict uses drugs, and addicts are bad people. This is the idea of the label, the undesirable characteristic, and then the stereotype. Unfortunately, people react to the stereotype, leading to social distance and potentially discriminatory acts. So let's think about some addiction labels. So the question is, does it really matter how we talk about addiction? There is a leading professor, scholar in addiction medicine who says that yes, it really does matter how we talk about addiction. This is John Kelly. He is a professor of psychiatry and addiction medicine at Harvard, and he is one of the leading scholars in addiction medicine. So thinking about addiction labels, addiction language carries stereotypes and elicits stigma. So when we think about the word clean, for instance, in the context not of cleaning our house, but in the context of thinking about those who may use alcohol or drugs. When we think about the word clean, it really refers to no drug use. So when we think about this word in a context of alcohol or drug use, it raises questions about purity of self, spirituality, and body. I've done a lot of work with individuals who are current users of alcohol or currently use alcohol or drugs. And one thing that I distinctly remember from working with a number of individuals is them talking about how their body was unclean when they were using drugs and thinking about themselves as being unpure. Words like dirty, for instance, it provokes images of bad or immoral behaviors. And also words like untreated, it refers to potentially an uncontrolled condition. So when we apply these words to individuals, it dehumanizes them. Oops, I think I went all the way. Okay. So John Kelly, he has suggested and called for an addictionary. So this is the idea of, yes, the words we use matter, and we need to be really mindful of the words that we do use. The Recovery Institute has created a glossary of addiction-related terms that are stigma, that alert us to words that could potentially be stigmatizing. So for instance, if we think about the words abuser and addict, these are stigmatizing words. Rather, instead of using these words, we should think about using first-person language. Rather than call someone an addict, say he or she suffers from addiction or a substance use disorder. Rather than using the word clean or dirty, for instance, when referring to a urine test, rather than saying a clean or a dirty urine test, use proper medical terms, a positive or a negative test result. Rather than use the word drug, use specific terms such as medication, a non-medically used psychoactive substance, and this is really to avoid ambiguity. Instead of relapse, lapse, or slip, use morally neutral terms like resumed, experienced, or recurrence of symptoms. There was a study done at Johns Hopkins University by a number of investigators, and what they looked at was public perception and public opinion of mental illness compared to drug addiction. So it was a survey, an online survey with a sample of 700 plus individuals. And the questions that they examined were around stigma, discrimination, treatment, and public policy. They had a sample of about 700 individuals. And what they did is they split the sample in half. Half of the individuals answered questions regarding those with drug addiction, and half answered questions regarding those with mental illness. And they asked questions, for instance, like, would you be willing to have a person with mental illness marry into your family? Or would you be willing to have a person with a drug addiction marry into your family? Questions like this to get a sense of how do people think about individuals with a drug addiction versus individuals with a mental illness. And they had a number of questions linked to these different themes of stigma, discrimination, treatment, and public policy. And what they found is that there were more negative attitudes about those with drug addiction compared to those with mental illness. So for instance, they asked a question, would you want to have a person working closely with you who had a mental illness or who had a drug addiction? And 22% of people said that they would work with a person in recovery. 62% of people, so that is 22% would work with someone with a drug use history. 62% of people would work with a person with a mental illness. There was also higher opposition to policies that would benefit drug users in recovery. So 43% were opposed to providing health benefits to those with drug histories, compared to 21% of those opposed to those with mental illness. And these are benefits that are accessible to the US population in general. So really this idea of very stigmatizing attitudes toward those individuals with drug addiction or drug addiction histories. So this raises the question, how do people really think in particular around drug addiction? Is it a treatable medical condition like diabetes or heart disease, chronic condition? Or is it a personal failing, something that only happens to bad or weak people? And what their study found is that despite drug addiction, alcohol use, being a chronic treatable health condition, it's viewed as a moral failing. So we see that how we think, how publicly or popularly we think about individuals with a drug addiction, for instance, is that it is a personal failing, it is a moral failing. They are bad or weak people. So let's think a little bit, I'd like to talk a little bit about how stigma plays out among those who are actively using alcohol or drugs. What research consistently shows is that stigma is a major barrier to engaging in substance use services. In one study, 28% of people with substance use disorders perceived a need for treatment, but they reported stigma as the reason for not accessing care. We know that stigma affects the quality of care delivered by healthcare professionals. It affects referrals or linkages to services, and it also affects decisions regarding what services are needed. So as I have mentioned before, I've done a number of studies working with individuals who are currently using. And I want to share with you a little bit about how I have seen stigma played into individuals' experiences of the healthcare system. So I'll focus on one woman's story. Right now I'm currently at UC Riverside, but prior to this, I did work in the Central Arkansas Veterans Healthcare System, and I did a lot of work with individual veterans who were current users of alcohol or drugs. And this one particular slide is about the experience of a woman who sought VA emergency care after being kidnapped, raped, abused, and threatened to death by two men who had gang raped her. So she went to the VA hospital, and these are her words. I went into the VA hospital and I said, I need help. And what she wanted help for, what she went there for, was essentially her rape that had just happened. I couldn't stop crying. It was either VA or the bridge and jump off it. They just did the suicide thing and sent me to inpatient mental health unit. So she believed the rape was overlooked because, she says, My P-test was dirty, so it was just she's a drug addict. They didn't see anything but substance use. And in this interview with her, she restates the provider's words, how she interpreted the situation, that clinical, that healthcare setting situation. This is a crackhead whore that says she tried to kill herself. For her, crack had become her slow suicide because this wasn't the first time she'd experienced sexual abuse. It had been repeated over time. This, in my opinion, this story, this one woman's story, gives an illustration of how stigma, how that influences stereotypes about individuals who use alcohol or drugs, and how this has very real consequences for people's experiences in healthcare settings. So let's talk a little bit about stigma and recovery. So those individuals who are abstaining from alcohol or drug use. So when we think about individuals who are in recovery, they continue to experience discrimination, and this can undermine their ongoing recovery efforts. So they may experience personal slights, microaggressions, microdiscrimination. The idea, for instance, that others may perceive them as being untrustworthy, dishonest, or potentially about to relapse. Also, they may experience violations of personal rights, so that's macro-level discrimination. They may be denied employment, or they may be denied accommodations. Or in this case, the one woman's story, we see how she was denied her right to a particular kind of test that she had requested in support service for her sexual assault experience. Let's talk a little bit more about recovery. There was a study done not too long ago, about a couple years ago, by John Kelly. Again, this is one of the leading figureheads in addiction medicine and in recovery in particular. He did a study, a national study that estimated the rates of individuals who were in recovery. And the question that they used was, did you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, but no longer do? And what they found was an estimated 9% of the US adult population, that equates to about 22.35 million individuals, are in recovery. This is the idea that recovery is an individualized, intentional, dynamic, and relational process, and involves sustained efforts to improve wellness, and individuals abstain from alcohol and drug use. What is critical to recovery is personal growth. Personal growth is a pathway to recovery. I do just want to point out that this is a huge amount of individuals, nearly 10% of the US population, that are in recovery. And this is recovery specifically from having a previous use of drug or alcohol. So now let's take this concept of recovery and think about students in recovery. So who are they? What are their challenges? How does stigma shape their recovery experiences, and what do they need? There was a study done by Addict and published in 2015 in the Journal of Substance Abuse Treatment that is one of the few, if not the only, study that characterizes students in recovery. What she did, or what the investigators did, is they took a look at all of the students who were enrolled in recovery programs. And this was about a sample of 500 individuals or so. And they asked them some questions about their drug use history, their current mental health, their past mental health, any diagnoses, and really kind of what their life was like at the moment. And what they found among this sample is that there was a lot of previous history of polydrug use. So again, these are all individuals who are in recovery. So alcohol, marijuana, and drug use, heroin, crack cocaine, pain medications. They found that 75% of this sample of about 500 students was diagnosed with a mental health disorder. The top three disorders were depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. The primary lifetime problem, so the reason that they reported why they had decided to enter into recovery, was 52%, about 53% reported drug addiction as their primary lifetime problem, and about 40% reported alcohol. 10% also reported having behavioral addictions, so sex and love addiction and disordered eating, and 40% were current smokers. This kind of gives you a snapshot, at least into those individuals who were surveyed in this one study. So, raising questions about what are their challenges. One, students in recovery live and study in abstinence hospital environments, and I'll take a moment to talk a bit more about that. They live and study in a context where there is a culture of drinking and using. And often institutions, campuses, universities, they pay most attention to harm reduction. So for instance, I have up here this headline of a news article that is about mixology classes. Mixology classes was a creative way, rather than traditional standard approaches of creating public health campaigns to reduce harm related to alcohol use, for instance. The focus is often on alcohol use in university and college campuses. Rather, this particular university, what they did is they decided they wanted to be really creative of figuring out how can we teach our students that there are teach our students about other options for safe partying, but also teach our students about alcohol use and abuse. And how they did it with the mixology classes is they asked students to enroll basically in bartending school. And what they did is they provided students with education in a fun and interactive environment for them to learn how much alcohol really tastes good in a drink, and how much alcohol should be in a drink, and how much alcohol should you really have in a given time frame, how much is too much. So this is one way that universities are creatively thinking about how to reduce risk related to alcohol use in particular. But the point here is that the focus is often on harm reduction and alcohol use and reducing that use and any consequences related to alcohol use. So going back to this idea of abstinence hostile environments, there are a number of factors that create an abstinence hostile environment for college students. So the first one is that students are transitioning into college lifestyle and adulthood. It may be the first time that students are independent from their families. And not only are they independent from their families, but they have all these new freedoms, and they're around peers, many of whom are their same age and going through something similar. They have much less structure and supervision. Certainly they have their classes. However, they are making choices and they are making decisions independent of their parents, independent of others. And this is an environment where they experience a lot of opportunity and freedom to do what they want to do. They also experience peer pressure, very much peer pressure to use substances. Again, this will also depend on the peer group, the friend group, individuals, the student social circles. But if you think about it, for instance, fraternities are renowned for pressuring other fraternities and sororities, for pressuring other members of Greek life to use. So, for instance, if a student is in a context where there's a lot of peer pressure to use certain kinds of substances like alcohol and drugs, that student may not feel comfortable saying no, and they may not have the skill set to say no. And also, feeling isolated at a time when fitting in is crucial. So what I've heard over and over again from students who are in recovery is how uncomfortable it is to be in an environment like this and to feel peer pressure to use and to have to say no and to experience how others perceive them and treat them when they do say no. So continuing with this idea, college campuses are very much shaped by a culture of drinking. This is in conflict to recovery status for those individuals for those students who are in recovery. Drinking is a ritualized and integral part of college culture. According to the NIAAA 2015 College Drinking Facts, 60% in their survey of college students in the past month prior to the survey, 60% of students drank alcohol. 2 out of 3 binge drank in the past month. We know from this work that 20% of college students meet the criteria for alcohol use disorders. That doesn't mean that all 20% of students are actually diagnosed with an alcohol use disorder, but from this research that has been done, we can estimate that 20% of college students meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder. So why is this potentially problematic? So what are the consequences of an alcohol use disorder? It disrupts the student's ability to meet home, work, and school responsibility, and it affects relationships. And again, just emphasizing that there is much institutional attention to harm reduction on college campuses, but unfortunately, which is wonderful, but at the same, because it does really reduce risk, studies have repeatedly shown that it does reduce risk for alcohol-related sexual assault, for instance, or alcohol-related injury. However, unfortunately, the focus on harm reduction means that there's limited attention to students in recovery. And some of the reasons why this might be is because there is a moral image of collegiate recovery and recovery programs that it could signify, or it could be perceived, that the campus has a drug problem. Also, students in recovery are an invisible population, so we really don't know how many students are in recovery on college campuses. We have a good sense now from recent work that's done by Kelly and colleagues that about 10% of the U.S. population, 9% to be exact, of the U.S. population identifies or reports, not identifies, but reports as recovering from drug or alcohol use. So we really don't know yet much about students, how many students are recovering or in recovery while they are on campus. And this also means that there's limited resources and capacity. Because this is an invisible student population, we don't really know what resources they may need, and we may not have the capacity on our campuses and our healthcare services to be able to treat this population. So unfortunately, students in recovery lack access to a recovery community. They lack access to collegiate recovery programs, to drug and alcohol-free spaces, and to recovery services. So this could be things like 12-step meetings or counseling services that have dedicated individuals with expertise in substance use, for instance, or expertise in recovery support and management. And this further isolates and stigmatizes students in recovery. And I have a map up here. This is from the Association of Recovery and Higher Education. And they have plotted all of the recovery programs across the U.S. And I believe there's now maybe 100 or 130. I can't remember off the top of my head. But you see on the West Coast, we have about 20. If you just think about, we have 10 UCs in our UC system. We have 10 campuses. And I believe that there are 2 that the Association of Recovery and Higher Education identifies as having collegiate recovery programs. I believe it's UCLA and Santa Barbara. But this map really says that we really have a lack of these resources across our nation, not just on the West Coast, but across the nation. We have a lack of collegiate recovery programs. And what we do know about recovery and isolation is that it is not ideal. So students who experience isolation, this does not help them along their pathway of recovery. So let's shift a little bit and talk about what are students' experiences of stigma. There was a recent meta-analysis done of qualitative studies that had looked at students in recovery. And one of the main themes that they identified, I believe it was in the last 20 years, and the main themes that they had identified from the 10 published articles that have been written about students' collegiate recovery experiences, which is really quite limited to begin with, is that stigma was one of the main themes that came up. Internalized feelings of stigma, identity, shame, and exclusion. So this quote right here is from a student who is in recovery from a published work by Bell and al. And the student says, It's a worry that people are going to treat me differently and treat me weird and think, you know, I can't invite her anywhere because she just can't drink. And it may be a bad idea or not, I'm not sure, but I want to be able to get to go to some parties and, you know, do some things with the group. And what we know about the students' experiences of being a student and also being in recovery is that these are transformative experiences where identities are shifting. And one of their identities of being an individual in recovery has a very stigmatized identity associated with it. So I want to shift and talk a bit about my recent project, or the current project that I have going on that's called the Photo Voice Project. This is a project that I began about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago actually. And it began because we here at our own university, we really wanted to understand what students experience, students in recovery, what their experiences were like. And we wanted to say that yes, there is a population of students in recovery here. And we really need to start thinking about who they are, what their needs are, and what their experiences are like. So what we did is we chose to use a particular kind of method. It's called Photo Voice. This is the participatory action research method. It's a method that's grounded in health promotion principles and critical theory on education for critical consciousness. And also it is a community-based approach to documentary photography. Why we chose this is because it is an action-oriented method that ultimately the goal is to enact structural level change. So what we wanted to do, we didn't want to just do a surface level, okay, these are students in recovery, this is what they look like. We wanted to say, okay, these are students in recovery and this is what they need and this is how we need to move forward. And using photography is a great way for students to be able to share their experiences, their ideas, and their recommendations. It's incredibly powerful. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the students. For this study, the students were UC students in recovery. They were undergraduate, graduate, or medical students, and they had to have been in recovery from alcohol or drugs for at least 6 months. And so this means that they had to have not been using for the past 6 months, or if they had defined it slightly differently, maybe that they defined it as they were actively involved in a pathway of recovery, and maybe there were moments of reuse during these 6 months that they were dedicated to their own recovery. And what the participants that we had, there were 17. This is a small qualitative study. We had the majority of students between the ages of 18 to 24 years, women, Latinos, and undergrads. So UC Riverside is a Hispanic Serving Institute. And if you take a look here at Meet the Photographers, what I want to pull or draw your attention to is the importance and value of education. This one student says, coming to college is my second chance to live and start a new life. Some of the students in our sample, they had been actively using when they were in high school, and some were able to get treatment while they were in high school, or else they were able to cut down and stop using before they got to college, whereas some started using when they were in college and they stopped using while they were in college. It was definitely a mix of what people's experiences were like, and it was also a mix of the kinds of substances that they used. We learned that the campus environment, it is characterized by a culture of drinking. Students talked about their experiences of being the neglected addict. They also talked about their recovery path and their pathway, which very much included academics, critical, art, and being in nature. And they also told and shared a bit about what they needed in terms of recovery support and services. I'd like to go ahead and focus a bit right now on the theme of the neglected addict. So really, what are students' recovery experiences? Students shared with us that they feel judged, neglected, and lonely, that they see the damaging effects of substance abuse on their relationships, their daily life, and their academics. They view their self as both good, the recovering self, and bad, the addicted self, and they struggle every day. They know that reoccurrence of use is always a possibility. So again, we had students use cameras to visualize, to show us what their recovery experience is like. And these images that I will show you are all associated with this theme of the neglected addict. This image right here is of a broken glass, and what the student says in terms of the meaning of this image to her recovery experience, and particularly to feelings of being stigmatized, is, I feel really exposed, is the best way to put it. I feel exposed and like, obviously, something's wrong with me, like the crack in the glass, like there's something in my makeup that is wrong and people can see that. This next photo is of a tree that's split, and the student says, it's like a part of me has fallen, but the good part of me is still standing. But yet the part that's fallen is still there because it's a part of you. This is this idea of students having these positive and negative images of themselves in both photos, of the recovering self, which they associate more so with the good and the more positive aspect of themselves, and then the addicted self, that they associate a much more negative connotation with that identity. This image is of a robot that has fallen in a desert-like Southern California environment. The student says, I love the little robot because he's lying down in a kabbalistic type setting. It's barren and it's deserty. Sometimes I felt like that, just lying down, stuck in a spot where there was no hope almost. And this image is of a student in recovery who has beer bottles around her, surrounded around her, and she's alone. And she says, people are embarrassed to think that, like, oh, I might be an alcoholic. I think it's helpful to know there's this service and there's people like you out there. You're not alone, kind of thing. Like, you're not the only one thinking this way. Where if there's no services, then it's kind of like, wow, does that mean no one else is interested in this? No one else needs this service? And our emphasis here is really around the lack of services that she has found on campus, in general campuses, the lack of services for students who are in recovery. So again, with this project, we asked students to use photography, to use a camera, to share with us what is it that they need. And one thing that we found is they need people to really value that they are a student, not only a person in long-term recovery, but they are a student. They find so much strength in having overcome their past addiction and in being a student. They also said that they recommend alcohol and drug use policy change. So for example, student housing, yes, there are policies around alcohol, drug use. No alcohol or drug use, for example. In theory, that's the policy, but in practice, that doesn't always happen. And that's a really hostile environment for students in recovery when they're in these spaces, their own living spaces, where they feel as if they are not safe. What they want is safe and non-judgmental spaces, and this is for their living environments and for their academic environments. They want mentors who understand what their experience is like. They want increased access to mental health care services. So as I had mentioned in one of the previous slides of the research that has been done among students in recovery, 75% of the sample of those students who were in that study reported a mental health diagnosis. They also want counselors with lived experiences. So these are individuals who are also in recovery, and they want opportunities to meet others in recovery. Many of the students in our research, they had not shared with others, even family members, that they were in recovery, which I think says a lot about the stigmatized identity that students experience when they do have this history of alcohol and drug use. And this last image, this is of, on our campus, we have hills surrounding the campus, and the C is for University of California, Riverside. And it is very common for students, for student groups, as a bonding activity to hike up to the top of the C. So the C really symbolizes this sense of belonging and connectedness of our own community here at UC Riverside. What this student says, there has to be a sense of community and acceptance to an addict. Without the feeling of inclusion, it is easier to relapse and give up. If a UC or school in general can provide those securities for people seeking to improve upon themselves, then perhaps those people wouldn't be afraid to seek out the help that they desperately want. So, with the few minutes that remain, I know that this presentation was very much focused, at least the crux of it, on students' experiences or students in recovery. And while this certainly applies to faculty and staff in our UC system, I mean, given that 9% of the US adult population is in recovery, this has really wide-reaching implications, the idea of stigma and the stigma that individuals in recovery can experience. So when thinking about self-care tips, this is specific more so to individuals who may be working with those with past histories of substance use. But thinking about, what can we do if we are individuals like myself, for instance, working directly with students who are in recovery. This is a very stigmatized population. And the work that I do is not necessarily providing direct care, but I am working with students and listening to their experiences. And by the mere fact that I am associated with students and linked to students, I also experience stigma, the stigma of working on an issue that seems to be an increasingly uphill battle to engage others, for instance, in recognizing that these students, they are invisible for a reason, that they experience stigma, for instance. So keep in mind that students return to use. It's always a possibility. And this can be stressful, it can be heartbreaking, or it can be exhausting. It can be every single one of these and even more experiences. But we have to think about ways of coping and positive coping skills. So being mindful of how your students' experiences might impact your own emotions and your own preoccupation with their lives. And this really speaks to issues of boundaries and healthy boundaries, of remembering, thinking about work-life balance, but of thinking about, your students' experiences are not exactly your experiences, and being mindful of that and mindful of how your own students' experiences might be affecting your own emotional and psychological well-being. Learning about substance use disorders. I think that this is a great tip for faculty members who may be interacting with their undergraduate students who may be not showing up to classes, or graduate students who may not, maybe that they're not making deadlines, or there could be an array of different possibilities, but understanding what substance use disorders are, and also understanding, if you have a student who is in recovery, understanding what kinds of resources may be available on campus or in the local community, and also being supportive. If a student does share that they are an individual in active recovery, being supportive and recognizing that you may have these implicit or you may have these biases that you may or may not be aware of, and to be mindful of that. And then also to recognize that you too might experience stigma, that if you are an individual, for instance, who's working with a highly stigmatized group, that maybe some of the requests you have, or maybe the lack of resources that you might perceive, or obstacles that might come in the way, could this be connected to stigma? And being mindful of all those things is a good way to take care of yourself, and to also be able to advocate for yourself and advocate for your students as well. And of course, self-care. The goal is that we hope that these self-care tips, self-care in general will prevent burnout and compassion fatigue. Okay, And that is the end of my presentation. If you do have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me after this presentation. Obviously, we have the text or the messaging that you can send me any questions that you may have. I'm happy to answer them. And
Thank you so much, Dr. Cheney. Yeah, so far I haven't seen anything come in via the chat. So I will, of course, encourage everyone, if you do have a question, you can submit it now. I'm just going to run through a couple of quick sort of closing comments, and then we'll wrap up for this today's session. So it just, of course, in general, thank you everyone for joining us and for your interest in this topic and your willingness to learn. I just want to, of course, let everyone know about the behavioral health, including substance abuse benefits that you have, faculty and staff, you have individual benefits. If you have questions about your behavioral health benefit, you would go to UCNet and you would search using the keyword behavioral health. Every plan member has a behavioral health component to their medical benefits coverage. And you may not be aware, but we do have employee assistance and faculty staff assistance programs. Many of them are actually have offices on campus where you could, if you felt like you were in crisis or if you just felt like you needed to talk to someone face to face, you could go to that office and you would be able to speak with a counselor. There is also a list of all of the EAP resources. It's also available on UCNet. So you would search UCNet using the keyword EAP. And students, please know that all students have access to either free or low-cost counseling and mental health services and substance abuse services on their campus, regardless of what insurance they have. Students would utilize the Student Health Insurance Plan. It's also known as SHIP. And if you have, which provides you the insurance coverage for mental health services. And all student care would begin at their student health or student counseling center. And then they may be referred to an off-campus provider by student health or counseling, but their care would still be covered by the plan. And for information, students should go to their campus student health webpage, and they'll find links to information about how to use the plan, along with plan booklets that explain everything that's covered. And again, letting everyone know that the recording link will be available by the end of this week on the Stigma-Free UC page on UCNet, which is part of the system-wide well-being. So please share the link broadly with your colleagues, families, and friends. And finally, look for an announcement about our next webinar, which will be in September. We are skipping programming in August, and that information will be on the Stigma-Free UC page on UCNet. So with that, I will do a final check of the, oh great, we have some nice comments. Let me just make sure there's no questions. Look like a couple of thank yous. The audio, oh interesting. Someone said smoking seems to be common with mental health or drug addiction. I'm not sure if, did you see that question, Dr. Cheney, or a comment?
Yeah. And I'm not sure, smoking seems to be common with, is it men or mental health or drug addiction? I'm not quite sure. I don't know what mental is.
Yeah, smoking seems to be common.
I don't think that's a mistake.
Yeah, but maybe whoever posted that comment, if you want to.
Mental health. I think it's mental health.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. So there's a lot of overlap. It's an addictive behavior, tobacco and other drug use. That's how we often think about it. And mental health, for instance, it could be a stress reduction technique. So there's a lot of research actually working on more public health related research, working on risk or reduction of tobacco among individuals with mental illness and also drug addiction. It is very, very common. Yeah. And you could see even in the slide that I did bring up about students in recovery, 40% of those students who are actively in recovery, they were smoking tobacco.
Right, yes. And of course, you've gotten a number of thank you, great talk, thank you, very important topics to cover, great stuff, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, I will go ahead and just in case there's, we will end now so that everyone can head off to lunch. Of course, I'll leave the chat open for just a few moments in case you want to pose a question. And if you want, of course, if you want to, and Cheney's contact information, it will be part of the recording that will be posted on UCNet at the end of this week. Okay, thank you again so much, Dr. Cheney.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.